Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Hannah Tyler. In this week's episode, we're breaking down the midterms and what they might mean for the issue of immigration. Theresa Cardinal Brown, Managing Director of the Immigration and Cross-Border Policy Project, welcomes Laura Hall, the Managing Director of BPC Action, and Casey Christine Higgins, Senior Counsel at Akin Gump, who both have several years of senior-level experience on Capitol Hill, to chat about how the issue of immigration played in the midterms, what the election might mean for the potential of lame duck legislation on immigration, and how the next Congress might approach immigration as an issue. We recorded this episode on Wednesday, November 9th, before all the races had been called, so walked through multiple different scenarios of House and Senate control and what they might mean for immigration legislation possibilities. A great episode to come, so stick around.
And welcome back. This is Theresa Cardinal Brown, Managing Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. And I'm here with two experts on Congress to talk about what we think might be the outcome of this election on immigration politics. I'm here with Casey Higgins, who is with Akin Gump and is a BPC fellow and former policy professional for immigration and trade for former Speaker Paul Ryan, and Laura Hall, who is Managing Director of BPC Action, our government relations entity. So welcome to you both.
Hi.
Thanks, Theresa. It's great to be here.
Thanks for having us.
So we are recording on Wednesday, November 9th, the day after the election at around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And I say that because, as we have seen in the last couple of elections, the day after the election, we don't necessarily know how everything is going to turn out for the next Congress. So we're going to go based on what we know right now. And by the time you listen to this, things may have changed. And we'll go through a couple of different scenarios. But let me talk a little bit just about generally how immigration was a part of the midterm elections. Casey, let me start with you. Can you talk a little bit about how immigration as an issue has played into this midterm cycle? How have Republican candidates especially utilized or talked about the issue?
Yeah, thanks, Theresa. I think that this has been a prominent topic on the Republican side of the aisle, less so on the Democrat side. But I think in the broader context of the record-breaking numbers along the border crossers this year, an influx of asylum seekers from multiple different countries, and really a traumatic change in circumstances, even from last year where the number of border crossers went up about 1 million. I think that really framed the election from an immigration perspective for Republicans. You add to that the ongoing fentanyl crisis as well in overdoses. And I think the second topic out of most candidates' mouths on the stump was the border and increasing border security. So on the Republican side of the aisle, I really do think it was something that they utilized a lot in responding to, people's frustration with the fact that our border is even if it's not secure, is also just at a fundamental level not able to be managed by our government right now.
Yeah. So, Laura, Casey mentioned that for Republicans, it was sort of a one or two issue that came off the tongue. But we've seen polling that says that immigration is like a top issue for a lot of Republicans, particularly Republican-based voters. But it doesn't necessarily rise above maybe fourth or fifth for a lot of Democratic voters. Do you think that dichotomy in election cycles manifests itself in how the parties deal with the issue when they do get into power? We've seen both Republican and Democratic Congresses in the last few years. How do you think that plays out when it comes to legislating?
Yeah, I think it definitely does. I mean, we've seen for the past decade or so immigration mentioned on the campaign trail, but I think we know when presidents, Congresses, lawmakers get into office, they don't have an unlimited amount of time, amount of bandwidth to do everything they want to tackle. They usually only get to pick like one or two big priority issues that they're going to work on. And, you saw tax reform from the Republicans, you saw climate change and Dodd-Frank and Affordable Care Act with the Obama administration. I think think both of those administrations and in the Biden administration also have kind of talked about immigration, but there's so many things they want to do in so little like time and bandwidth, and that election mandate that they have to kind of move something forward. They usually have to just pick a couple things. And I think, as you mentioned, it's maybe a top 5 issue for Democrats, but not necessarily a top 1 or 2 issue that they're going to feel that on day one, this is the thing that I really need to roll up my sleeves and start working on.
Yeah, so we'll get back to that when we talk about scenarios for the next Congress. But just one more question sort of about how immigration played out in the midterms. We don't know, frankly, the control of the House or the Senate right now. Been some surprises in the election outcomes. Some people who made immigration a very big part of their campaign won, and others who made it a very big part of their campaign lost. Casey, for the parties as a whole, do you think this election will change how they prioritize it at all?
I think that we can expect the House is going to flip to Republicans, and I think that they have made this through their Commitment to America, which was launched this fall, a key part of their agenda. So I think you are going to see, once again, Republicans go back to, we need to secure the border. But I think where in recent years it was pair border security was something else, what Republicans are saying now is the border is at such a crisis point that we need to address border only, border first, and we can consider other issues after that, but only after that happens and happens separately. So I think that they have, again, they've been talking about this. It's like the number 2 issue behind the economy on the campaign trail. And I think that they are going to, really make border security a top focus as they go into their majority and trying to respond to Americans' frustration about the situation at the border.
Yeah.
And I might hop on to Casey's point, too. I agree with her. I think it's 100% pretty sure that the Republicans are going to take the House. The chamber that we still don't know about is the Senate. But the one thing we do know about the Senate is neither party will have a 60-seat majority, which is what it takes to get major pieces of legislation to move through the Senate, absent some kind of procedural tricks and things like that. So despite what comes out of the House, I feel like we'll have a very similar dynamic that we've had the past 2 years, where the House Democrats passed a lot of kind of left-leaning progressive immigration legislation, and then it didn't have anywhere to go in the Senate because they didn't have 60 votes to move it forward. So I anticipate that the Republicans will probably try to do the same, get some of their immigration messaging bills passed, but we might not see some of those bills get signed into law absent, the use of kind of some of those procedural tactics in the Senate.
Yeah. So you guys have skipped ahead to next Congress, but we still have a little bit of the 117th Congress left, even after the election, the so-called lame duck period, where even members that have lost their election or are intending to not resign at the end of the term are still able to vote. So let's talk about the outcome of the election and how that plays in the dynamics of what happens in the lame duck. And as you both mentioned, as of right now, we don't know who has the House majority, but most of the conventional wisdom of the prognosticators right now is that Republicans will take a majority. The number of seats is still up in the air. The Senate, we really don't know. Outstanding as of this time period that we're recording, we don't know who won the Senate races in Arizona or Nevada or Georgia. And those are pretty big ones. Georgia, we know, is going to go to a runoff on December 6th. So if that race is the one that determines who controls the Senate next year, we won't know that until late this year. So with that uncertainty, let me start with you, Laura. What does the uncertainty about what will happen next year mean for potential lame duck legislation? How does this play into the current party leaders' plans, or frankly, the administration's plans for a lame duck?
I think it's a good question. And I think that to the extent that we're almost always in constant campaign mode, I mean, we had the election yesterday, and it's almost like the 2024 presidential race starts today. But the news with the Georgia runoff means we are 100% in campaign mode for the next 4 weeks. And I think that determines, what the House leadership and the Senate leadership, for that matter, are going to take to the floor. Raphael Warnock, the candidate in Georgia, is a sitting senator. He's going to have to take votes on anything that they might bring to the floor in a lame duck period. I think that party leadership on the Democratic side is going to be thinking very carefully about what votes they might bring up that he's going to have to take, and how that might influence his continued campaign, which, is now stretching into overtime, essentially, with this runoff. So I think that that's a dynamic that we can't ignore, that, the campaign is not just, counting the votes and seeing where the votes are out there. There is still active campaigning that's going to be going on between Walker and Warnock for the next couple weeks. And I think that that's going to determine kind of how this issue plays.
Yeah. Casey, what do you think from the Republican side? Do you think Mitch McConnell will change his thinking, between now and December 6th? And then let's fast forward. At the end of December 6th, or maybe shortly thereafter, hopefully, we will know who will control the Senate next year. And how does that play into what happens after that?
Yeah, there's a lot of back and forth about what will happen in the lame duck. And as Laura said, we're now in campaign mode for 4 weeks longer, which in a lot of ways shortens the lame duck. Instead of having 6 or 7 weeks, and frankly, 4 or 5 was what we had built into the calendar. So now the question is, how much time is left behind that? Because it's, you've got leadership elections that we expect in both, likely on both the House Republican and possibly Democrat side coming up. So you've got all sorts of static in the air right now, right? There's lots that has to be addressed. So in addition to try to dig in and get things done in the lame duck, despite the other noise surrounding a lot of these issues, is often very difficult. So what is going to happen in the lame duck? We've got a funding vehicle out there that is a potential vehicle for a lot of things to ride on if you can get there instead of just a CR. And it sounds like from the Republican side, while there is some pressure from the right flank to kick that into when, it sounds like Republicans will be in the majority, at least in the House, I do think that, broadly Senate leaders and the House leaders have been interested in getting an omnibus spending bill. So that provides a vehicle for some of these things. But again, you have to be able to really have them negotiated, signed off, get four-corner agreement to get them added. Now, there's a lot of immigration topics that are being discussed in the lame duck, right? There's an agricultural guest worker bill that's being negotiated in the Senate that might come up. There's talk about DACA and border and things like that. So the conversation is ongoing, but I think it's just still really difficult to see if you can get both sides together on very politically and substantively complex policy, given this short time frame, given everything else that's happening. And again, given this Republican position as of late that the border is so bad that you cannot, move on to DACA or legal immigration fixes before you address the problems at the border.
And I can see Republicans too. I mean, they feel like, at least on the House side, they just have, 6-8 weeks until they get to be in charge and setting the agenda here. I'm not sure they'll feel the desire to start with a compromise position. And I don't see the Democrats being willing to take up or discuss a border-only bill. I just don't see what might drive Republicans to the table in the lame duck when they feel like if they just wait a little bit longer, they're the ones that get to kind of control the narrative around this issue.
Yeah, and it's a great point, Laura, too. People often forget, frankly, as if the House does in fact flip, the vote for the Speaker happens the first day of the new Congress, and it happens among the entire House of Representatives. So while there will be a leadership vote next week among the Republican conference for the Speaker, presuming that the House, does flip to Republicans, the actual vote for Speaker comes at the beginning of the next Congress. So there's going to be a lot of pressure, I expect, on leader Kevin McCarthy in the meantime, who's vying for that Speaker gavel, not to put votes at risk by compromising with Democrats in the lame duck.
Yeah. So we did, Casey, you mentioned some of the issues that are outstanding on immigration, the DACA border. The Afghan Adjustment Act, the National Defense Authorization is still outstanding and has some immigration potential there for things like PhD STEM grads to get green cards. Some of these are really bipartisan issues. You mentioned the farm worker bill. if they have bipartisan support, could that lend itself to adding them onto some of these must-pass bills, either the NDA or the omnibus? Or do you think just immigration in general is such a hot-button issue that it's going to get left on the cutting room floor?
Look, I've been in the room on these end-of-the-year negotiations in a leadership office, and immigration is very often a red line item, right? It's often one of those things that both sides say, we can't touch it because once we go down this path, we're really down the rabbit hole, and it's politically problematic. I caveat this with there are a couple issues that typically ride with the Omni, H-2B being one of them, and H-2B is actually another area that there are ongoing negotiations about, can you actually reform it? So there are some of these things that ride. The other thing that I think is a bit of a different dynamic this year is that the Fifth Circuit just rolled on a DACA case. And while the Fifth Circuit remanded the case back, we think it's still going to make its way back up the court system through appeal, and we expect that it will still reach the Supreme Court. It may now do that in June of 2024, in June of an election year, and it would reach the Supreme Court before then, but we would expect a decision in June of 2024, and we expect that decision would terminate the DACA program. So I think that is something on people's minds, that within the next couple of years, DACA is going to be terminated, and that has driven activity on this issue among Republicans before. So I do think it's a lingering question. Can you take DACA, pair it with some border security, which, as I'm going to sound like a broken record throughout this podcast, but Republicans are saying border, border, border. Can you find a narrow deal in that space that buys us some time, to hopefully address it, but after the next presidential election? We'll see. Again, it's just really tough. It's a political hot button issue in what is going to be a noisy lame duck with not a lot of time to negotiate.
And the other thing to keep in mind with end-of-year bills is that they're kind of kitchen sink pieces of legislation. I mean, if you're talking about something like the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, there's probably something that almost every member likes in that bill and doesn't like in that bill. So, this is sometimes a place where folks can sneak in a provision or two that's like a little bit of swallow your vegetables, even if they don't like the whole thing. So it could be something that lends itself to that. But then, Casey's point is exactly right, that this is something that could maybe turn folks against voting for such a big bill like that leadership considers kind of must-pass legislation. So if it's something small and fairly non-controversial, there might be an opportunity to kind of bury it in the bill. But if it rises much beyond that, I do think the options for it are kind of slim, because they wouldn't want the chance that they might sink the entire package for the immigration provisions.
So just keeping with the lame duck for a little bit longer, who are the potential leaders on any immigration stuff that happens in the lame duck? Or, Casey, does it really just boil down to the leadership at the end of the day? So
typically in these scenarios, you have to have all four corners of the authorizing committee to sign off. Judiciary obviously is the Committee of Jurisdiction on Immigration Issues. I don't anticipate that is going to happen. Our leaders on the Judiciary Committee on both sides of the aisle are in very different places on this issue. So it's a bit of an interesting dynamic from that front that kind of leaves it in the hands of leadership. And, I think if you are going to include something and you're going to bypass your chair or your ranking member, the leader of your party on that committee, you're going to have a pretty strong justification for doing so. And that justification will come from other members saying, we really need to have this addressed in this package. So, I think it kind of remains to be seen if anybody's going to step up, frankly, on both sides of the aisle to forge a bipartisan negotiation deal and then pull enough members along that can support that and go to their leadership and say, look, we know this isn't perfect, but we support this and we think it really needs to be included. And then give leadership the incentive to actually allow it to be put in a package. Because at the end of the day, it's, a four-corner deal, the big four members of leadership that make that final decision.
Yeah. All right, so let's jump into the next Congress. Again, we don't know party control just yet, so let's build out the scenarios. We're going to presume right now that the House goes Republican, and let's say it has a 20-seat or less majority. That seems to be where most of the polling and prognosticators are right now. But if the Senate stays 50-50, let's say where it is right now, so Democrats maintain control by virtue of the vice president's tie-breaking vote. What do you think that kind of a scenario would mean for immigration legislation in the next Congress, and what would be the party priorities? Who wants to go first?
I'm happy to go first. I think I alluded to it a little bit earlier. A 50-50 Senate with a Democratic president means that we have a Democratic tiebreaker. So if there is ever a piece of legislation that is brought to the floor that just needs a simple majority, I think the Democrats, and they can hold their caucus. That's another thing to think about, too. They would have to get every single Democratic vote in the Senate, which I don't think is a sure thing. And then they would have Vice President Harris, as a tiebreaker. They could bring some things to the floor there, but I'll go back to my earlier point that most big pieces of legislation that move through the Senate do need a 60-vote majority to kind of get moving. And could it be something like farm workers? Could it maybe be something like DACA? Potentially. Comprehensive immigration package, I just don't see the math to 60. So I think that some of these things might be coming out of the House, but I don't think they go anywhere in the Senate.
Casey, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, as I noted before, we expect House Republicans to make immigration a big part of their agenda, and it's going to be border. And that will be their focus. They want to make meaningful progress on border security before they are willing to consider other things. So, but as Laura notes, the Senate is where magic can actually happen, and that's where you have to compromise. Again, something's going to have to go through the House too. But just focusing on the Senate for a minute, I happen to think that the gateway drug to doing more immigration here is a deal on border and DACA. And it's border because that is the prerequisite for Republicans. In a lot of ways, DACA is the prerequisite for Democrats. And DACA actually has a lot of support among Republicans. So if you can get Democrats to agree to do some meaningful things on the border, meaningful and enforceable things on the border, I think Republicans can come along on DACA, especially if there is a threat through the courts that is going to be terminated. And I think if you can find some common ground there, that allows you to really be able to hopefully then move on to other immigration issues. You've shown that Congress can act on these things. The world won't end politically. And now that we've kind of gone through this first step, again, gateway drug, we can start doing more of this. So whether or not you can find that compromise, whether the political stars align to be able to put, those 60 votes together in the Senate. And then, again, we've seen this movie before where you had a Republican-controlled House that couldn't move a bill that the Senate moved or wouldn't move a bill. So, then the question becomes, is there some sort of way that you can appease House Republicans broadly on this? You'll need Democrat votes over there as well for something like this, obviously. So, look, immigration is always hard, but there are some things out there right now that, the border being at crisis levels and the threat to the DACA program that could prompt some actual action from Congress.
So we're talking about Congress, but as we know, in a 50-50 Senate, the vice president gets the tie-breaking vote. That means the administration that always has a veto pen, the president always has a veto pen, but with the Senate's tie-breaking vote, they kind of have a little more leverage over Congress, if you want to put it that way. Where does President Biden go in that kind of scenario? Could he push on Republicans? Would he want to make a deal on DACA and border? Would that be something that would help him if he's going to run again in 2024? We're thinking a little outside the box here, but, if the president decides he's willing to make, say, that DACA border deal, can he bring his party along?
Yeah, I mean, I think if he wanted to make this like his number one top priority, and we know we're heading into a big presidential election in 2 years, and obviously his record is going to be, up for debate and on kind of on the ballot, I think he could. I think the answer is the question is, will he? And I don't know. I think that there's a lot of priorities that are competing for his and Democrats' attention these days. I think the fact that Republicans have been so clear about what their terms for the deal are, I'm not sure. I think Democrats are there yet to have that conversation on border. And it feels like that's just what needs to happen. And I'm not sure they're exactly primed and ready for compromise conversations at this point.
Yeah, and I think from the Republican side, and this is again sort of a deja vu from the Obama days, but there's a ton of frustration with the administration that they won't admit there is a crisis at the border. Obviously, they have made quite clear that they are going to give Secretary Mayorkas, a parking spot at the Capitol because they intend to haul him in that often for oversight purposes. So look, what does that mean? That means they do not trust this administration, this president, this DHS secretary to actually take care of the border. And so I think that there's an enforceability concern there as well. If you're going to cut a deal, and I've heard this from multiple offices, if you're going to cut a deal, it has to be something that's enforceable. You can't just, have the administration ignore this border part. Look, we encountered the same things, like I said, in 2013 and 2014. And is there a way to tie legalization to actual metrics being satisfied on the border to make sure that you're actually securing the border? And it goes back to the Reagan days where conservatives feel like they didn't get the border security they were promised then in exchange for that quote unquote amnesty, and they refused to allow it to happen again. So how can this administration, help to forge a compromise? I think from the Republican perspective, if there was a way to show that they're serious about this and they recognize the crisis, that would go a long way. But as Laura said, it's unclear whether the administration is willing to tackle this, or if Democrats, really want to embrace the fact that, something needs to happen from the Republican perspective on the border.
So let's look at a different scenario where both the House and the Senate turn to Republican control. Again, probably with slim margins. What does Senate Majority Leader McConnell do if he has a 51-49 majority? How does Speaker McCarthy manage his House Republican conference and deal with McConnell in that scenario overall and on immigration? Casey, you want to take that one for starters?
Yeah, so look, I think in a lot of ways it's similar, right? I mean, you don't have the tie-breaking vote that you have, so it's not unified government. But if we're talking about in the first scenario that the House flips, you already have divided government. So now we just have divided government with the House and the Senate. Under this scenario, I think it's more likely that the Senate attempts to move some really border-heavy provisions that move out of the House, and not pick up and move the same ones, but try to make some progress on that front. I think that the Senate is going to be more willing to make some concessions to the Democrats to include in that to try to get those 10 votes. But then the big question becomes, will the president sign it? I would hope that, we can get to the point that to get those 60 votes, you've got the White House on board too. And if we're going to finally pass immigration legislation, it's not going to get vetoed at the White House. But look, I think that's an uphill battle as well in the current environment. So, I think it always strengthens Republicans' hands to have both houses. But as Laura mentioned earlier, the Senate, you need 60 votes. So it's always going to be more bipartisan. And from, the House perspective, it's not going to go far enough on a multitude of issues, which creates its own problems in and of itself. So, again, I think it's... As is the case with immigration, always, it's tough under all these scenarios.
And we know the one scenario we know, absent something really wild happening, is that the presidency is not going to change hands in the next 2 years. So, even if you have both legislative chambers controlled by the Republicans, we will still have a Democratic president. So we're looking at a divided government kind of no matter how you slice it in these scenarios.
Yeah, and I would just note too, Democrats have both houses in the presidency right now, and we have not made progress on immigration under this
it's a hard issue.
Circumstance either. Right. So I think it just, Republican or Democrat, I think, if you're not able to do this in a bipartisan way, you're not going to get it done. But doing bipartisan immigration is incredibly politically difficult for both sides. So I bring that up only to say that it doesn't matter what the scenario is. This is tough stuff.
Yeah.
Yep.
So let me ask you this: try to get to a productive bipartisan discussion on immigration. What do you think both sides need to be bringing to the table to make that a real productive discussion, one that's has a reasonable chance of kind of moving something legislatively?
I think that an open mind and willingness to compromise. I think that this is an issue where folks have become so dug in. Sometimes this issue helps more as a talking point than it does as a legislative victory or success story. I think that, the two sides could not be more clear what they want, and they know what the other one wants. So to me, that argues it's not, we don't understand what the other side's looking for. They don't come to the table. The tables are set. They're out there. It's just they don't necessarily want to share a table or check in at the other person's table. So I think that if we are going to get this done, it does have to be, neither side can think of it's an all or nothing, that, hey, I'm going to get everything I want. And there's going to have to be give and take. And that is a bit of a lost art these days. We have done stuff like that in the past. But, I think we need to get back to that conversation.
Casey, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think that's 100% correct. Both sides know, for the most part here, where the compromise lies. And I think on a variety of things, right? I keep talking about narrow, and I think that I do believe that a DACA border deal is the gateway drug to be able to do more. We need to be able to show that you can do immigration and the world won't end. And that's how we build the confidence to do more on immigration. But those, I think, are the first two steps. So oftentimes as well, the problem is, there's a moving bill on immigration, and if we don't pile everything onto it, we'll never have another chance again. And I completely understand that instinct, but at the same time, it does not work on this. It hasn't worked, and we need to try something different. And I think that something different has to be narrow bites at the apple. So you pair DACA with border. I think, ag is something we keep talking about. I think that if you can have mandatory E-Verify as part of that compromise, I think that goes a long way for Republicans. So there are things that you start putting the pieces together, to pair them together, and each side gets something that they want, and they have to make a concession as well. But as Laura said, I think, it's going to take a genuine interest to actually step up and compromise, and then go explain to your constituents why you made that compromise. And I harken back to when my boss I worked for Paul Ryan, as Theresa alluded to, and he would go into a town hall meeting. It would take him 8 minutes to go through all the different topics of immigration, but he would do it and do it thoughtfully, and he could explain his positions clearly to his constituents. And I think they appreciated that, even if they disagreed with him. So immigration is complicated, and frankly, all of our lawmakers could be more educated so that they could turn around and educate their constituents on it as well. And I think that would be helpful to the confidence building exercise that needs to happen at some point to be able to move on immigration. So again, it's incredibly difficult, but I think the compromise, we know what it is, but it's time to start small and build up from there.
So, Casey, you mentioned earlier that Republicans, particularly Republicans in the House, are very eager to call DHS Secretary Mayorkas to account for the situation at the border. Lots of oversight and hearings. At least some members have called for the Republicans to impeach the Homeland Security Secretary. What would impeachment mean for Mayorkas, for the administration? If the House obviously votes to impeach, the Senate has to vote to convict. How do you think that would play into this idea that if we want to do a compromise, but you're impeaching my DHS secretary?
Yeah, look, I think that again, I think there's frustration among Republicans that the administration has not done a lot to acknowledge what they see as not only a security crisis, but also a humanitarian crisis along the border. I think they see the border as mismanaged. They have a lot of problems with what's happening right now. Does that rise to the levels of high crimes and misdemeanors that it takes to impeach, the Secretary of Homeland Security? Is that an impeachable offense? I think that they're going to have to do a lot of work to make the case for that, if the case does exist. And I think, that there is a inherent risk here of overreach. And I think that, they also campaigned on inflation and the economy and things like that. And does impeaching the Homeland Security Secretary secure the border? No, it doesn't necessarily. So, can we make sure that we're getting back to focusing on the economy and actually securing the border and things like that? I think that's what the people want. So I think the Republicans need to be careful here. But obviously, as you say too, Theresa, it's not really easy to get the Democrat administration and president together with a bipartisan coalition in Congress to pass immigration reform when you've got one house seeking to impeach the secretary. So, we will see how that goes, but I do think it very much reflects the deep frustration among Republicans right now about the state of the border.
So let's take it one step further. The other question is whether Secretary Mayorkas lasts for another 2 years. Does he resign? Usually after the midterms, there's a turnover, including in cabinet officials in a sitting administration. If the Senate turns Republican, what does that mean for a new DHS secretary and confirmation? Could we be in another place like we were for a lot of the latter Trump years of simply not having Senate confirmed leaders at these agencies?
Yeah, I think we could. If this is something that obviously there's a focus from the Republicans on. They have concerns about how the current administration is handling it. I don't think necessarily a change of personnel is going to change their views or their thoughts on the administration policies and procedures. So I expect it would be a tough confirmation fight, and they don't have a lot of wiggle room to lose votes.
All right. Any final thoughts from either of you on this midterm election? As I said, we may know more in a few days or a few weeks, and we'll probably come back to you both at that time to say, okay, now that we have the final grouping, what does it look like? But any final thoughts right now on the midterm and what it means for immigration?
I think while there is some things that aren't known, I think we do have enough of the picture right now to kind of know how things are going to be. And I anticipate, obviously a shift in the types of bills that are getting out there with the Republicans controlling the House. But I still do think that at the end of the day, neither party, much like the Democrats do not now, are going to have a big enough majority to allow this to sail through in one party alone. So that means compromise, that means bipartisanship, that means bringing folks to the table who want to actually work on this issue. And I kind of think that's where we'll be for the next 2 years if we want to get anything done here.
Yeah, and look, when you hear our conversation today, I'm sure people are thinking, well, nothing's going to happen. And while I understand that, I have two comments to make on that front. One, you have a ton of new members entering the House of Representatives. And frankly, you've got new senators as well. I think it's something like 60% or more than 60% of the House is turned over in the last 4 or 6 years. What does that mean? I mean, that means that if you work in immigration, you have to go educate those members, because if you sit back and you're not staying engaged despite the fact that legislative prospects don't seem high, you're getting behind and you're letting others inform these members without you offering your perspectives on a variety of issues. So that education piece is important. It is important to always stay engaged. And I say this because at some point the political stars are going to align and we're going to pass something, right? It is inevitable that at some point we will get there. We got there on tax reform, right? The Democrats got there on Obamacare with healthcare. You are going to find a moment where immigration is going to happen, and we better be ready for it. And if people are sitting back now and not continuing to engage, we may miss that moment, and then who knows how long we wait for the next moment. So that's just the other thing for those that are thinking that, well, we might as well sit back for 2 years, please don't. Please stay involved, because with, like I said, with Supreme Court potentially terminating DACA and things like that, there are moments that could arise that could present an opportunity for us to finally, make a big step forward on immigration, but we got to be ready for it.
Well, Casey, Laura, thank you both very much. As I said, we will probably have you back again once we see how things play out at the beginning of the next year. But thanks for being on This Week in Immigration.
Great to be with you.
Thank you.
And that's it for our show this week. One last reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow the Bipartisan Policy Center on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. You can follow Theresa Brown at BPC_T Brown, and I'm on Twitter at HannahETY. I'm Hannah Tyler. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by Theresa Cardinal Brown. This week's episode was written by Hannah Tyler and Theresa Cardinal Brown. Alex Verisco produces and edits our show. The executive producer of BPC Podcasts is Lucy Manning. See you next time on This Week in Immigration.